Welcome, listeners, to Lost and Searching. Today, we're speaking to Ellie Ford, an award-winning exited entrepreneur, an executive coach, and the chief people officer at Zinc VC. Why do so many people feel like they aren't living up to their potential? Ellie started her career off as an anthropologist and documentary filmmaker and is obsessed with figuring out how people work, much like myself. So join us as we chat about how to actually understand and find our potential, the different kinds of goals we should really be setting ourselves, what the conditions are for courage and confidence, and what the difference is between those two things in the first place, and so much more. Let's get into the show, and I hope you enjoy the journey. One of the things I reflect on when I think about the conversations that we have is that we are all a work in progress. We are all on a journey of our life, on the journey that is our lives. And life is a journey, it's not a destination. That means we are forever a work in progress, at least from my perspective.
Absolutely.
I wonder if people take this seriously enough, if people respect that enough, or respect what they need to make that happen enough.
I think you're absolutely right. And I talk to our founders about that all the time. And it's by even just saying to people, you know, we're all work in progress, it kind of opens out the conversation a completely different way. It creates sort of self-awareness and a playfulness and experimentation that's not normally there. But if you think about it, every message that we have from when we're tiny is that we kind of reach a point that we'll know. We'll reach a point when the world will become clear and that will be the finished product. And actually, this kind of concept of not only lifelong learning, but kind of lifelong evolving is something that's not kind of put to us when we're small. It's not something that we receive as a truth. And I think like everybody that I'm working with around me all the time, you know, they are evolving, but quite often they're doing quite drastic changes. So from one primary to a secondary, going from who they were to who they're becoming. And actually, we're taught so much about how we talk about what we've been, and we're so ill-equipped to talk about who we're becoming. And so I think kind of firing up people's imagination on who they can become and what that could look like and how they need to, you know, bring new parts of themselves to that and develop parts of themselves in that process, I think is the exciting piece. But we need to go from that starting point that we're work in progress, right? And I say to the founders quite a lot, you know, we talk about pivoting, iterating, prototyping, testing our products and our services. Like, why are we not doing that to ourselves and our relationships?
You mentioned clarity. How clear can we get? If there's never a place of absolute clarity we get to, we are searching for clarity. So like, what does clarity actually mean and how clear can we actually get?
I guess from my perspective, it's about awareness. And I think like awareness is curative, right? So if we're aware of who we are and how we are in the world and maybe some of the things that are kind of getting in the way, then we're better placed to do something about it, right? So I think clarity potentially, but clarity of sight, clarity of awareness, I think is where I'm putting that. We're always going to be subjective in how we see things, but we can do it with greater awareness of like who we are and how we're showing up. So, I mean, I use Tim Galway's formula quite a lot, right? Which is that performance is potential minus interferences.
Okay.
And if you think about it, you want to get your performance and your potential as close to each other as possible and dial down those interferences. And we've all got them, like we've all got interferences. But to your question, if we're clear about what those interferences are, if we're aware of what those interferences are, then we can much better kind of work on it and do things with it. So for example, I don't know, I'm aware that in a group, I can shut down. And that kind of confidence or that second guessing of myself can actually stop me from really showing up it's an interference, right? And it's definitely getting in the way of my potential, leading to my performance. The more I'm aware of that, the more I can work with that, the more I can talk about that, the more I can test and do experiments in that space, which moves me to the kind of the next version of me, back to this version of work in progress. So I think that's kind of really helpful way to kind of increase that clarity.
What gets you up in the morning? Why do you do what you do? How do you, what's really driving you to get out of bed and do what you do?
Humans, people. And it's always been that. It's the kind of curiosity around the human condition. So who we are, how we behave, how we relate, how we kind of move through the world and interact and behave, and the kind of cultures that we create is, you back to the sort of point of awareness. I think you become more aware of what motivates you as you get older. But I think, to be honest, even like the 5-year-old me was really curious about other people. And that thread was just pulled through, studying anthropology, which was definitely about humans and how humans behave and how they form societies and cultures, but also the kind of patterning of that and how we think about what's kind of universal to the experience of being human and what's kind of specific to particular cultures, and then drawing out from that a greater understanding of what it's like to be with others. And then I went into documentary filmmaking, and again the kind of the sort of resonance or the threads from that were around how do you tell other people's stories. How do you question some of the assumptions that we have about the way that we live and who we are? And how do we kind of platform different ways of being? And I was really interested in that from showing other people's perspectives. So I think it's kind of the secondary sort of answer to that is that the curiosity really for me comes with lack of judgment, and telling a story from another perspective and doing the bridging, the translation that can come from really understanding other people is massively motivating. So I think filmmaking for me, again, was another way of kind of doing that. And then if I sort of extend that into what I'm doing now, again, it's like, how do we, like founding is such a, volatile, complex, challenging, courageous thing to do. But it's also so dependent upon the humans that are doing it. So how are we sort of supporting those people that are kind of busy with this big change that they want to see in the world because they've identified problems that really matter? And how do we create the kind of systems around them to support that journey best? So I think kind of even in an environment which maybe thinks about the products, it thinks about the services, it thinks about the kind of science, actually there are people there. There are people there that are driving this change. And so much of whether they succeed or whether they fall is based upon how supported they feel and the people that they meet and the kind of inspiration that they have and the support they receive. And so for me, that's the thing that kind of gets me out of bed.
So let's paint a picture of some context here, right? Because I think what I really want to figure out with you today is what our potential actually is and how we discover it. Mm-hmm. So let's take a big step back and understand what humans are capable of. And sometimes I think the best way to do that is to almost reverse engineer process of elimination. What aren't we? And often we get in our own way, right? Sometimes I think our biggest enemy is ourselves. And I notice that within myself, and then I notice that within people I work in, and I go, oh, this isn't just me. This is all of us.
For sure.
You mentioned as a foundation, let's start here. You mentioned your experience telling other people's stories and noticing why we do what we do. What patterns did you notice people falling into in all the work you did in the past, telling people stories, that background in anthropology? What are the greatest challenges that you think humans construct most often for ourselves?
Wow, that's such a big question. And I completely agree with you. I think that we get in our own way quite a lot, right? And I think, looking at it from the perspective of the kind of interferences here. So what I see kind of founders, what's happening here in relation to kind of people getting in their own way, like partly there's that thing around confidence, right? There's that thing around, do I deserve to be in the room? is my voice kind of, does it deserve to be heard? The sort of second guessing that can really influence whether we kind of lean forwards, we say our piece, like we show up fully. And it's interesting because I think confidence is something that we've got such a complicated relationship with it. So we never have it like the right amount of confidence, right? We're always told we're too confident, we're overconfident, or we're underconfident, that we're not showing up. Actually, we never have like the right amount of confidence.
Okay.
And so this kind of idea of actually being much kind of more rooted in who we are and how we show up, and the belief and trust in ourselves, actually. Viv Groskop talks about it as this kind of idea of happy high status, which I think is a really nice way of like reframing confidence, because it's, as I say, confidence is such a loaded word for all of us. Like we've all got such a kind of reaction to it. And actually the people that are often the most confident, overconfident, really kind of shouldn't be sometimes. And equally the people that we really want to hear from are kind of holding themselves back. And so she talks about this kind of notion of happy high status, which is this idea of like not second guessing, showing up as your most authentic self, right? Really knowing with a kind of ease that you've got something to contribute. And so I think like confidence, I definitely see as kind of getting in the way of people creating kind of new, bold things, and actually trying to create environments where they feel that happy high status. And so therefore they can kind of show up best is something that I kind of work on. So for example, like you can definitely see that in investor relationships, right? Where there's, back to the word status, where there's kind of conversations with investors where you kind of feel that difference of like power, that difference of status. And then how do you recalibrate that so that you're showing up as the kind of person that you want to show up as with the thing that you want to share with the world, right? So that is definitely something that I work with people kind of quite a lot on, is how they do that best, kind of owning their voice, owning their space, kind of being in their body, thinking a bit about like how the power sort of structures that are around us can get in the way of us really contributing. And obviously there's so much work to do, right, to try and kind of open out those spaces so that all kinds of people, voices, perspectives are being heard. So I think in terms of innovation, change, what the world needs, the more that we can create spaces and individual kind of reactions which open out that potential, then the further we'll get.
So much of this challenge is taking place in the unconscious, right? Thinking about power structures in particular. Sure. It's sometimes someone knows they have power over someone or someone has power over them. Often I think it's unconscious ego. The ego is involved. And so how do we do the noticing? Right? If the noticing is usually, the awareness is usually the first step to changing anything. So you can't change something you don't know you need to change.
Yeah. Back to
or to influence, right? So how do you do the noticing?
Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree with you. And actually, some like social theory talks about the fact that we need to like surface the kind of embedded structures, right? The subconscious structures that are actually influencing our behavior. So there's some like really good like thinking and kind of writing on that. And actually the idea is that if we surface those structures, then we can do something about it, right? And if we don't, then we're kind of victim of it. And I think that investor one is a really interesting kind of example. So talking to, let's pull it down. I think it's always really helpful to like pull it down to a sort of situation. So let's say a single female founder is going into an investor scenario. The power differential there, one person's got the money, one person's asking for the money, right? One person's trying to convince that they've got something that could be in the world. You're telling essentially a story about the future, and you're trying to convince that not only will that future be this way, but you've got the solution to it. And then you've got the other side of the table, right? Which is the people that are kind of making that judgment, making that decision, doing that diligence. And it's interesting, looking at, I think it's very unlikely that you don't feel that reality of like power differential. The way it was showing up for that female founder was like, in her body. She could feel herself, like how she was sitting, how she was feeling, how she was kind of holding herself, whether she was leaning in, whether she was leaning out. Also, the kinds of things that were put in there to deliberately increase that power differential.
Okay.
So, oh, you're asking for this amount of money. I've spent more on a table than you're requesting. To immediately kind of like accentuate that idea of status, right?
Okay.
And so when we're in that, like we can respond in like all kinds of ways which just make that kind of more of a problem, or we can notice it and we can have things prepared or things within us or responses or awareness that allows us to recalibrate. So the work I did with that particular founder, for example, was using transaction analysis, where you think about the parent and you think about the adult and you think about the child. And so the parent can be kind of like powerful and protective, but it can also be powerful and domineering and shut you up. The child can be curious and spontaneous, or it can be kind of weak and a victim. And what you want to do in all of those situations where that transaction is happening in a way that's not helpful is pull it back into adult-adult relationships, right?
Okay.
And seeing that kind of play out of saying, actually, you're saying that to me, but actually, can I just like remind you of the offer that I'm putting in front of us? So let's get back to, if this is not interesting for you, or if this is not a check you want to write, then that's absolutely fine. There'll be other places for me to take this.
Hey everyone, I wanted to take one quick sec to talk about a new partner that I am so excited to announce I have on the show, an agency called Untapped. Untapped exists to put your brand in the world's pocket with beautifully crafted, high-impact mobile experiences. They've worked with brands like Barclays, EA Sports, American Express, and even the UK government. They're known for creating powerful apps with intuitive, seamless interactions that drive customer engagement and elevate brand recognition. But it isn't just tech development. Their expertise is bridging phenomenal quality technology with beautiful design to create the highest quality product possible that takes your users on a real journey with you. You may remember Will, the founder of Untapped, from episode 13 of the podcast. If you haven't heard that chat, I highly recommend it because it shows you what kind of no-nonsense, sleeves-rolled-up kind of people he and the team he's built really are, and it reflects in the kind of work that they do. They want to make their clients' work recognized across their industries and drive real game-changing value, something I've personally experienced and appreciated working with them myself. For businesses who want to take this next step in their journey, Untapped can help with everything from tech creation to brand design to product marketing and so much more. All right, the links are down below. Check it out. And now back to the episode.
And so pulling it back into that kind of...
I love this because this is a very practical way of pulling out what's happening energetically, right? If someone has a power dynamic or has power over someone else, they like it and they know it.
Yeah.
They're kind of taking someone else's energy and they can kind of feel the other person's like shrinking, and we can pick these things up, right? So much of our communication is nonverbal. It's physical, or it's in the kind of way we speak, as opposed to the words that we say. So this person's kind of taking some energy back from her, taking some energy away from her, and she's kind of almost either taking it back or shutting down the confrontation in the first place. Because that's what it is. A power dynamic taking is confrontational.
Yeah.
I've turned this into who can take, who can win. It becomes a battle or a fight. Actually, no, this is a negotiation. It's a conversation. And it's just
exactly
brings
that.
it back down to earth.
Exactly that. And again, unless you surface it, then you can't do anything with it, right? So, and I think it's that, and I think it's also the kind of the high status, happy high status piece, the confidence piece that allows you to kind of fully know that you've got something to share, right? And not be reduced, I think, by those kinds of situations.
How much of this is, or could we chalk up to culture and cultural differences? Right? Because so much of VC is in the States. I'm from LA. Life's very different over there in these kind of ways. In Europe, culture and power dynamics are very different. In the UK, you've got your way of, again, the way culture plays into these things and the way people are taught to act certain ways. So, I mean, how much, with your overview, the anthropological,
That's the word, yeah.
overview, how much do you see culture being a factor here? How much do we need to play with culture or respect other people's expected norms because of culture.
And it's interesting because, you know, culture exists on different levels, right? So you can talk about the kind of artifacts of culture, so the kind of things that are tangible and manifest, but you can talk about the kind of implicit elements of culture, which are essentially values and belief systems and things that are not seen but drive our behavior. And essentially culture at the very basis is like how we do things around here. That's all it is how we do things around here. And ultimately, how we do things around here is going to look really different dependent upon the country that you're in, the environment you're in, the domain you're in, the sector you're in, right? And so I think there's a degree to which we have to kind of conform to the culture that we're part of when we see it. But there's also ways that we can, you know, show up as ourselves, which can challenge, which can question, which can kind of put our agenda on the table. I think there are lines that we probably can't cross in some environments. I'm sure if you go to Japan or if you go to China, if you keep your eye on the kind of end game of what you're trying to achieve, that doing things in a certain way is just going to be necessary to have that end game.
Yes, I totally resonate with this. I like to see myself as someone who can adapt to a different culture, can almost chameleon to different cultures. That naturally begs the question, well, who are you in these different cultures or different places? And actually it's an adaptation of within the frame of how I speak to someone or certain cultural norms, still having my essence, energy, personality, whatever words we want to use, but adapting it, knowing that that's okay, because what the fastest way to achieve whatever result you want, you're there for a reason, is to work with other people. If other people are the gatekeepers, you've got to do what works for them.
And you can hold both those things together at once.
Yes. Right? Really practically, the question becomes how. Because we can think we're being respectful and then accidentally lose ourselves in the process, or think we're adapting to a culture and accidentally lose ourselves. We can also think we're being ourselves and totally miss the mark of what's needed in the situation because of someone's cultural expectations or whatever a culture demands of us.
And look, there's like no blanket answer to that, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be individual and it's going to be kind of contextual. I think there's probably something about how far you are from your own value set, which is probably a kind of measure of that sort of thing. So, you know, you can kind of check how you're showing up and how you're behaving around the things that kind of really matter to you. And I think that's probably a way of doing it. If you're talking about a different lens on a version of 7, which has to be this way in this context and this way in this context, and that's the best way to reach the outcome that you know really matters, then I don't think that's kind of problematic. But I think there's probably something about checking in with ourselves and our kind of values. And for me, like values are really, you know, they're not things that we paint on a wall, right? Our values are the things that drive our decision making, just like drive our priorities. I often talk about values as being things that we put to work through things like even over statements, right? I value this even over something else, right? So it's 2 good things, but I value that even more than this.
Yes, this is an exercise I used to do when I started learning to coach and I started learning NLP. Was you take 2 things that are important to you and weigh them up. If you had to have just one or the other, which would you have? Or if you had to label this a 10 out of 10 or a 1 out of 10, which of these is more important to you? You make that list of like 10 things. Okay, well, is it most important to you that you have 2 kids, or is it most important to you that you have X job of X position? I want both. You can have both, but if you had to choose, well, which is more, well, and then you get your order of priorities.
Exactly. And if you have 10 priorities, you've got no priorities, right? So if you have 3 priorities, you've got no priorities. I think like this idea of, you know, one good thing even over another good thing. And so, I mean, we use it here because we use those kind of values to say, actually, let's say we believe or we value having impact in the problems that really matter and the evidence of that. We value that even over knowing that the process to get there matters, right? So you can imagine another organization saying, actually, we really value process over something else, or we unlock exceptional human talent even over knowing that everyone deserves a chance. Both those things are really positive things. And there'll be organizations and businesses which are completely focused on the fact that everyone deserves a chance. It's not Zinc, because we work with certain types of people doing certain types of things. So therefore it drives the kind of people that we back, the kind of founders that we bring in, the cohorts that we build, the people that we employ. So I think it's like those kinds of values I think are really important, just as ways that we get really concrete. And I think of, those values and the kind of culture of those values almost like a compass, right? It navigates you in terms of the decisions that you're making on a day-to-day basis.
I think there's a difference here between a company's values and yours. Often as entrepreneurs, what entrepreneurs will do is they'll take their values and be like, this is the company's values. But that might not actually be right. And if we need to start with the self-leader, if it all starts with us, we need to have our own values and our own purpose carved out a little bit. Do you think people spend time on their own personal purpose in life? Or enough time, or any time?
Seven, such a good question. I think in an ideal world, actually, our own values and our company values should be as close as possible.
Okay.
So, Brené Brown talks about the fact you can't really have two value sets at the same time. So I think there's probably just a kind of an alignment and mapping process between the company that you're joining and the things that really matter to you, which doesn't mean there's a perfect fit, but more or less. So for example, at Zinc, we value bias to action, right? We value backing exceptional potential. We value having impact in the world in real ways, right? If those things aren't your values in some way, then it's just not going to be the right place for you, which doesn't mean that there aren't lots of other places that will be. So I think if we take that kind of Marx idea that our work is essentially a creative extension of who we are, then ultimately you kind of want the business values and your values to be as close as possible. And I often talk about values because obviously we've got like the earlier stages of teams here. They're like building these, embryonic teams. And it's interesting because if I talk about like what they see in each other, you get quite quickly to the values of that third entity of the team. So the things that really matter to that team. And I say essentially that business is the DNA of those two founders, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's some piece there around like how the company has to, from a founder's perspective, the company is the value set of those two founders extrapolated into this other sort of system, the business. Mm-hmm. If you're joining a company, then you're looking at that kind of closeness between what the company values and what you value, and doing a kind of rational exercise about whether that fits.
Okay.
Or maybe a heart exercise, right, about whether that fits. And then I think there's probably something else which you're asking in that question, which is about how much space we give to our own kind of what matters to us, what's important to us, when we think about the kind of ways that we're putting our time and talent professionally.
Yeah.
What I try and do with my team is think a bit about alignment, right? So if you're thinking about the kind of high goal, the dream goal of what people are aiming towards. So that's a sense of being, that's not a sense of doing. So what's it look like, this role, in relation to where you're heading to, okay? And how can we try and leverage like your own purpose for the business purpose, but also the business purpose for your own sense of direction, and be explicit about that, right? So I think what doesn't work is where you've got a kind of direction, a piece of work that you're doing within a company, and then secretly on the side you're thinking, well, actually, I kind of think I want to do this. And it's like, well, let's just be explicit about that, because if that's what you want to be doing, number one is we need to find ways if you can develop that here and see if we can bring those two agendas together so that we really unlock the maximum momentum. If that's not what you can be doing here, but it's actually really what you want to be doing, let's talk about how we support you in the next steps, right? And I think when like the mistake is quite often not like ventilating those thoughts, not giving air to those thoughts, right? Otherwise, people end up having this kind of shadow activity, which is the thing that they think they might want to do, which is not their day-to-day. So like
and the energy just gets diverted.
And the energy is diverted and diluted, and actually there's no win for anyone. And so I think kind of it relates to your question, right? Because it's the idea of actually not only how much space do individuals give to that sense of discovery of their own purpose, but also how do we do that within a professional setting, and how do we make that work for people? So, and of course, this, we're talking sort of vaguely idealistically here about how it could be, but there are so many more opportunities for that than I think we actually kind of allow.
I'm keen not to conflate values and purpose. I accidentally did that a little bit. And I do feel there's a strong difference between this is my value set. These are the principles I use to guide my life. And this is why I think I'm here. And if this business helps me achieve that more for now, great. If then in 10 years I've sold that business, do I have a new purpose now? Or do I have no purpose because my purpose became that business? So I think we can have vehicles to achieving a purpose which reflect our values. And we can have a purpose as a person, and we can instill that business itself with a purpose that's aligned to us, but might be a little bit different.
I mean, I think we can here go into purpose in relation to goals.
Okay.
And so I think if we think about even taking sort of models like Whitmore, for example, that talks about the kind of layers of goals that we have, right? So people often have an end goal in mind or an end purpose in mind, which can often be about things like, I'm going to get that job, or I'm going to sell that business, or I'm going to run that marathon, or whatever it is. And then you reach that point and you basically deflate, because you're like, oh, I thought that was the thing.
Would make me happy.
I thought that's the thing that would make me happy.
Yes.
Which is why he talks about kind of process goals, performative goals or performance goals, end goals. And then on top of that, this kind of dream goal idea, which is what I was kind of referring to earlier, which is that sense of being. So you can talk about purpose in that way as saying, actually, my purpose in life is, and it's a state of being. And it's much broader than I want to sell my company, right? That's an end goal, or that's an end purpose, okay? So you can think about the fact that actually what really matters to me is, I want to be doing the kind of work that I want to have this kind of impact in the world. I want to show up in this kind of way. I want to have these kinds of people around me. I want to be believing in this kind of future, right? And that can come to life in loads of different ways. And actually the end goal is just one version towards that kind of dream goal. Does that make sense?
I think so.
And I think it's stopping that sense of I've had one purpose now, because that's a mechanical purpose, right? That's a sort of transactional purpose. I'm going to sell a business. I'm going to, have X kind of impact. And it's very located in a particular example. But ultimately, you should be able to pull that up and say, there's a much more kind of state of being truth about me, of which that's an instance.
One of my sayings is that the journey is the destination.
Mm-hmm.
If we set a destination and we tie an expected outcome to that, that's when we're let down. The day after selling a company, I'm forgetting examples now. It's like someone sells a company. The day after, they wake up and they go, what do I do now?
Exactly.
They maybe had a day of celebration.
That's exactly the point. So it's because it's like that. It's that end goal, right? So it's like I've sold the company, and I thought that would influence my internal state, and it might have done for 24 hours, and then you're back to that searching, right? And so I think that searching and that quest is about, as I say, that state, that sense of being, which I think is for all of us to reflect on.
And what would be a good end goal? What would an example be?
An end goal or a dream goal?
Oh, good question. Both.
Okay, so for example, let's say you want to write a book, right? You want to write a book on the impact of entrepreneurs on change, right? Change in climate. You want to write that book. The kind of deflation that you're talking about is the fact that you write that book and then, it hasn't got the kind of impact that you wanted it to have, or maybe it has, but you still feel a bit kind of actually, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. I think if we pull it back within the sort of model that we were just talking about, then essentially, if you want to write that book, a process goal might be every day I'm going to write X number of words. A performance goal might be I'm going to find that publisher. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the end goal is that you've written the book. The dream goal is that you're a thought leader who's really influencing the way in which people understand their own role as entrepreneurs in affecting our climate disaster. That is motivating. And that's a sense of who you are as a purpose.
It's this idea, Simon Sinek's idea of the infinite game within that, the just cause that never ends. So this is why it's the dream goal to me, what I'm interpreting from this is something that is not fully achievable. Well, maybe not in your lifetime, or maybe not ever, because it's open enough. So like Google's mission statement is to organize the world's information. Look at them when you see a search engine and you see an AI system and Google Cloud, and which are end goals.
Yeah, exactly.
But the dream goal, organize the world's information, is broad enough they can keep going forever.
You've got it.
Okay.
Precisely.
Okay. That's really interesting. And so the start of this equation is the individual, is you, is the person, is the individual with a leader that they can be more of, reaching this potential. How do we know what our potential is? Right? If the goal is like, great, I have all this potential, and I feel, man, maybe even I don't know I have it, I feel that there's more for me, which is really powerful, but even more vague.
Absolutely.
How do I know what it is?
Yeah, and I think, I would say that we often underestimate our own potential, right? And so many things do get in the way. I think what we can look at is how it often shows up in relation to kind of knowing that there's more. And so it's often showing up in frustration. It's often showing up in despondence, impatience, restlessness. Absolutely. Okay. And so often Zinc ends up being a kind of attraction place for people who are just going, I know there's more. And you talk about feeling, right? It's like I don't know, I can't quite see it, but I know there's more. And I need spaces to kind of experiment with that, because I know there's more than what I'm currently doing. And actually, we don't get to that next version of our potential through thinking about it, right? We don't get to that through thinking we're going to shut ourselves in a dark room and work out why we're on this planet. We generally get to that by experimenting, by iterating, by prototyping versions of ourselves that really unlock that potential. So for example, right, let's say I'm in a certain role, but I'm kind of, it's the progression's slow, or I feel really far removed from the kind of impact and the end point of what I'm doing. Maybe I'm an academic, right? And I thought my thing was to really make a difference in terms of like this particular, I don't know, molecule that I was looking at or whatever. And then you kind of get to that point where you're like, God, I just don't, this is too slow. This is going to end up in journals. This is not, I'm going to be spending my time like in kind of peer conferences. Actually, the whole reason that I went into science, the reason I went into this is not being felt. And so it shows up, as I say, restlessness, impatience, frustration, lack of impact, demotivation, but also a dream that it can look different. And so I think this idea of just going, well, actually, I think that I've got the potential to do more than I'm currently doing. How do I experiment with that? And so how do I think of 3 experiments that I'm going to do over the next 6 months that test out whether all of the things that I've learned in that training that I've had and the place that I've got to could be better accelerated, better applied in different kinds of environments. And that might look like a version of me which spends the next 6 months, doing this podcast series, right? It might be a version of me that spends the next 6 months working, like reaching out to all of the sort of science-rich startups that might be interested in what I'm doing, and kind of thinking a bit about a small project that we might do together. So it's that kind of very action-based ways in which you're discovering and testing your potential on the understanding that returns to that first feeling, which is like, I know there's more. I know that I'm more. I know that I could do more.
I love having this frame. Immediately as you said that, a story came to mind one day, months and months, this was quite a while ago. I was walking down a street, was making some small shifts in what I was doing. So not as big as shifts I've taken recently with starting a show and other things, smaller. and was trying to figure out, how do I communicate myself, what I do and who I am. And I was walking down the street and I ran into someone I went to school with. We hadn't seen each other in years, catching up briefly on the street, as you do. He's telling me about what he's up to, and he asks me, and I say something. I don't remember what it was. I do X, Y, and Z, or I am an X, Y, and Z. And immediately I was like, no, that's not right. I didn't say that to him, but it was a feeling. Yeah. And I almost used him as a guinea pig.
You tested, right? You were iterating versions of yourself.
Exactly. That's what it was. Yeah. And so it shows up in these little ways. And so sometimes what I encourage people to do is just say a thing you're thinking out loud to someone else and see how it feels.
Absolutely.
Because if immediately it doesn't quite feel right, you go, okay, that isn't the answer. Okay. And don't be attached to it. I think because it's about us, it can so easily become us, as opposed to a test about how we communicate us, which is much further removed.
And we get really rigid about those versions of us, which I think stops the potential piece that you were just talking about. But it's interesting because exactly what you've just said is what I say to founders when they're, for example, creating their business, right? Is that I say, pitch it to as many people as possible. And then you start seeing what the lines are that feel right, to your point. Which are the lines that you say that make people lean in? Which are the lines that you say that make people sort of slightly check out? Which are the lines that make people think? And you start patterning that, right? And you say, actually, you're honing your kind of elevator pitch or whatever it is, the story of the business that you're creating through all of that data of how it's responding, but ultimately how you're feeling about what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And so I think your point is a good one, right? Which is that we don't often do that about ourselves. We expect to kind of have a fairly static way to talk about what we do or define ourselves by certain things, whereas we don't necessarily have to say, like, I'm doing a podcast. It's like, I can think of it in relation to what's keeping me busy at the moment, right? And then what are the things that are keeping me busy and how that might unlock some sense of what I'm interested in or what I'm curious about or where I'm intending to go next or whatever. But I think, again, we need to be sort of testing that in a way that's got movement to it. It's not, again, like facing backwards, it's facing forwards. And I think we're not often, it's back to your kind of first point around work in progress, we're not enough kind of testing those next versions of ourselves. And there's this kind of idea about, all of the, say, founders that I work with are going from one primary to a secondary, right? So I was, from an identity perspective, so I was I was a kind of corporate executive in something vaguely related to climate, but I'm now a founder, right? And so you're going from one to the other. But what's often happening in that is that you're going over some edge behaviors, right? And that edge behavior is really an uncomfortable place. And it's often showing up as things like avoidance, it might show up as anger, it might show up as humor, it might show up all kinds of ways, because essentially you're feeling that change within yourself. You're feeling that discomfort that's coming from the move from one to the other, from the primary to the secondary. And so I think we just have to feel a bit more comfortable with that discomfort around the fact that we are changing. You might have felt some of this yourself, right? Recently, it's like you were one thing, you're becoming another, and that's super exciting, but it doesn't mean it's comfortable. And it doesn't mean that at that edge, the kind of edge behaviors aren't coming out sometimes, right?
Well, you know what makes it so much easier is exactly that line you just said of, well, this is what's keeping me busy right now as I explore X, Y, and Z. Now, it's not a clean, sexy answer, which I think we're tempted to give, and that part can be uncomfortable. But if you can be comfortable saying, or accept saying, right now, this is what's keeping me busy. Because what you do is never who you are, and it never has been and never will be unless you make your identity about that thing. So even if you had a super clear, super easy, super sexy answer, it still wouldn't be 100% right and has some traps in it. Yeah. Exactly. So instead of fragmenting our lives, having almost the courage to give the answer that feels best right now. And I love this idea of testing it out. The same way in business, you test every little thing. Do people like this slightly more, this slightly more? Did this feel right? Did that feel? And then you can do the same with yourself. And if you are a work in progress, then the same way that anything in your life that's a work in progress, whether it's like a DIY project or a novel you're writing or the business you're building, you can also almost DIY test yourself. Hey, I just wanted to jump in here really quickly with an offer for you. Those of you who are a little newer to my work, which is most of you looking at the show's stats, will probably not know that for much of my career, I've been working with people to take more ownership of their lives as a coach, mentor, guide, and educator. This show exists to help people discover and cultivate their greatest inner leader. And that stems from a personal mission of mine. But what does it actually mean? Well, I break this down into 3 things: calm, confidence, and courage. We could all do with a little bit more, at least a little bit more, of all 3 of those things in our lives. But how do we make it happen? Well, that depends on us, on our temperament and our context, and so much more. So I've developed a free tool to help us understand 3 of the biggest things that I've noticed hold us back from those really powerful states to be in: restlessness, reactivity, and resistance. What I help folks do is move from that place into that place of calm, courage, and confidence instead. So you can use the link below to check that out. It's totally free, super simple, quick, and easy to use so that you can get just a little bit of clarity in that regard. And I created it just for this show because I noticed how important it was to overcome exactly those challenges. That's what the show is trying to help you do after all, so why not make it easy for you? So with all that being said, I really appreciate you. Hope you find that useful, and let's get back into this episode.
You can.
One of the other things I think is interesting, another way I think is interesting of discovering anything about what we can apply to ourselves is thinking about how we would apply it to others. The classic example of someone who can give someone else amazing advice, but can't take their own advice or whatever, right? I think sometimes being able to extract what makes sense in others and go, oh, is this something I'm saying? Because we're so close to ourselves, we can't see it. It's like when the mirror is right here.
Not only that, I think we are the harshest critics of ourselves. So it's not only that we don't see it, but we put a particularly difficult lens on ourselves, a particularly harsh judgment on ourselves. And I think, not everyone has it to different extents and whatever, but it's a truth that people feel that. So I think that idea of kind of distancing or slightly objectifying ourselves in a way that gives us a better reason or a kind of rationale or picture of who we are is really important. I think it also gets into that idea of some of the thoughts that we can kind of get attached to. And I love that whole idea of you're sitting with a thought, actually, I'm not explaining myself well enough. Or people are leaving the conversation with me where I explain what I do confused, right? And then you're like, do I know that to be true? How do I know that to be true? Is that actually true? And if it's not true, I don't know that to be true, right? I don't know the other person's going away like that. But it's how do I behave when I believe that to be true?
Yes.
Then I behave like I'm not very clear and I'm not fully owning my power and I'm sort of doing down the things I'm kind of achieving. And then the kind of next question in that is, who am I without that thought, right? Without that thought, I'm just showing up and naturally and organically telling people who I am in the world and what I do and what I'm busy with. And then it's and then the kind of the next frame from that is, what's the positive opposite, right, of that thought? People are leaving confused about what I do in the world. People are leaving really excited by what I do in the world. Or I'm confused by what I'm doing in the world, not other people. So you see what I mean? So I think this thing around actually how we're calibrating, questioning our own thought processes about how we're showing up and what we're believing, most importantly, I think it's a really important exercise.
This reframe is really powerful because if where attention goes, energy flows, if I assume I'm being unclear, I probably am, ironically, right? And, you ask that question of, well, is that actually the case? It gets you to just be a little more objective, which I love. Before asking yourself that question, if you're really deep in an emotional thought, you're probably right.
Absolutely. And the reason it resonates is because, it's something about your belief system, right?
Yes.
Not about other people.
And so if one of the strongest ways we can do the noticing is by noticing it in other people, right? That whole thing of we can look at someone else and understand it, but it's harder to objectively understand ourselves. I really like understanding things about others and then using that to reverse engineer and apply that to ourselves. So the question here now is, how do we spot potential in others? Maybe as well as that, how do we spot if someone isn't living up to their potential, right? Maybe you're sat across from someone, or you're working with a founder, or you're coaching a client or whatever, and something is telling you there's more to them, or there's more potential that they're not stepping into or owning. How do you tell?
And I think it's the exact opposite of what we were just saying that we often do with ourselves, right?
Okay.
So that kind of, shitty committee, or whatever we choose to call it, that's like in our heads. I think it's, what you're pointing to is the kind of exact opposite of that. And I think from my perspective, what you're speaking about there is leadership.
Okay.
Because I think the role of the leader is to see the biggest version of that person.
Okay.
And as much as possible, support that person to become that thing. And you're right, like we often need reminders of what the biggest version of us is, but it's always much closer to the surface and much more evident for other people than it is for ourselves. And so I think like what I try and like really prioritize as a kind of leader of people is actually holding that picture of the biggest version, like who you can really be, what that potential looks like, what that looks like if you really, blow it up, elevate it into something else. And then make sure that person sees that too. Remind them of that in those moments that are really challenging, and use that to kind of guide the way that you give feedback, the way that you kind of relate, the opportunities that you put in front of them. And it won't always be easy, but we so often need those reminders because we can get into our own heads. So I think I think what you're pointing to is the fact that this idea of potential manifests relationally, right? And it's the relational element of that is so important in order to stay at the kind of best version of who a person can be or what a situation can be. And so, and I think what I'm kind of adding to that as an extra layer is this idea of like who we are as leaders with that thought.
Okay. Are there any little signs or signals that you think are maybe more common or easier to pick up on that someone is kind of shrinking from their potential? Like if I think about a founder who's maybe listening to this, who has a team member who they think they can push harder to become even greater than they already are.
There's some really good work on this, and there's like it's not just a gender issue, but it sometimes comes out as a gender issue, right? So I've definitely seen examples of that within some of the things that women can often be have more valency for. So minimizing, I think, is one of those. Oh, I've just done this, or it's just this small thing, or it's just, not giving the full space and authority to the thing that you've actually created. Not acknowledging yourself and your own role in things. There can be things around, there's a great book on this called How Women Rise, and it's really taking this idea that what's taking you here won't get you there. And so pulling out some of those behaviours which are, to your question, kind of getting in the way of the kind of promotion that's needed or the belief that's needed for you to fulfil that potential. And actually back to awareness is curative. If we start having an idea of what those kind of 10, 12 things are, I think it's 12 or so in the book, then you start going, God, I do that. Yeah, I do that. And there's great examples of, so for example, there's something in that book where a woman and a man have both written this report jointly, and a crew come to film them. They film them individually. And the woman spends the whole time talking about the role of the man in that report. And the man spends the whole time talking about his role in that report. And so when the piece comes out, the film comes out, it looks like he's written the report. And so she goes to him and she's like, well, why didn't you speak about me? And he was like, because I assumed that you would speak about you. So I think because I think there's sometimes this imperative, as I say, I'm not locating it firmly in gender, right? This is just within this example. Because there can be this thing of like, I don't want to blow my own trumpet. I don't want to self-promote. Therefore, we can go the other way, which is actually not truthful. Like there's somewhere in the middle. So speaking well about the kind of work that you do with solidity and confidence and a degree of objectivity, not minimizing it, kind of using that in order to secure the most ambitious version of what you're doing next. So I think there are lots of ways that we can see people doing that in a way that's keeping them small. I'd like talk about playing big or something as a really important thing to look at if you're kind of thinking about that in relation to yourself.
I think this is the thing is what we notice in others, that's positive, we should notice in ourselves and we don't. Absolutely. So if we know someone else is not giving themselves credit where they deserve, let's say you've got, I don't know, a team member or even someone in your personal life who is, I don't know, they never talk about themselves as positively as you think they should because you know that they're better than how they communicate themselves. And if you know you'd pull them up on that, have a conversation, help them discover greater what they should maybe be doing instead, that's a sign to go, do I need to do this to myself? Just later, separately with yourself. Is that something I also need to say to myself, not just to them? And maybe the answer is no, but it's a way of pulling out. Yeah. Anything you would apply to someone else, ask yourself that question. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I love asking these kinds of questions in the second person. So as if there's a mirror in front of you and go, are you feeling the way you want to feel? Are you feeling awake yet? Are you too noisy or too quiet? Are you living up to your potential? Because there's a part of you that is speaking to the other part of you.
Right, exactly. And then we should be doing that like quite a lot. And also what you're allowing yourself to do in that, I think, is take yourself out of your own kind of biases and head into something that feels much more relational and allows you to bring the same degree of optimism, hope, belief, faith that you do to other people to yourself. I think there's so much that can be done from a kind of self-coaching perspective, which allows us to kind of just sit with those questions differently, reframe some of the things that we're thinking.
You work with a lot of leaders across business, and you're working with the person behind the business, right? And so over these years, and probably informed by the past work you've done, you must see a lot of people who feel lost, whether it's as vague and huge as lost in life to just lost right now. What do I do next in my business or whatever? What are the things or the reasons that have them feeling lost in the first place? Most commonly, most often that you see.
Lost is such a resonant word, isn't it? It's such a big word. It's such an emotive word. It's almost quite a visual word when we think about the word lost. I think if we look at it, you've given a few different scenarios there, and there's going to be loads of reasons why we might experience that big feeling that you're talking about there. Sometimes in a kind of like within a founding situation with a business scenario, there's so much ambiguity and so much uncertainty, right? That those feelings of being lost are true, because actually there's not a clear, if we think about the counterpoint of lost, it's like, knowing where you are and knowing where you're going, right? And being kind of quite clear and having a path. Whereas lost is, there's a degree of isolation, there's a degree of confusion, there's a degree of lack of visibility, all of those things, right? So kind of just pulling out a bit those two concepts. So I think if you're in a founding situation, like it's easy to feel lost because of that uncertainty, that lack of clarity, that ambiguity. And I often kind of think about the fact that really intelligence at its most basic is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do.
Mm.
And if you're lost and you kind of don't know what to do, then actually it's all about the kind of best guesses and the sense making that's kind of going on in that scenario, that's going on to allow you to take that next step, whatever that looks like. So I think like what I often do when I talk to people who are kind of the overwhelm of that, take the emotions down a bit in it, or just, reground basically in that kind of panic. Normalize the fact that the uncertainty and the ambiguity is there. Make it clear their capacity for sense making. Look at it systemically and then think intuitively, what's the next best step? And ultimately, that's kind of all we can ever do, right? We can think about what the next best step is, and that can take us out of that feeling of being lost. Also, lost is is a situation of like rumination, I think. So if we can get into one foot in front of the other, action, next step, experiment, try, bias to action, I think we can stop ourselves from feeling lost. Also, I think part of that normalizing that can, again, ground us is just normalizing the fact that, we're all feeling like that to a certain extent, right? It's particularly acute, I think, in a kind of founding environment. But I think we can all feel like that in different ways, right? Like changes can evoke that, all kinds of things that kind of the state of the planet can make us feel like that, right? So it's like if we use those kinds of techniques that I've just talked about to say, actually, let's normalize it, let's recognize it, let's kind of have a look and let's think about the next best step and let's try and prioritize action. I think we can move ourselves through it.
One foot in front of the other.
Yeah, it's basically that. It's basically that, but it's also knowing that we can often feel lost because we think there's a right. We can think there's a best. We can think there's a should. And that can make us feel very lost, right? And I guess what I was sort of surfacing there is that idea of in knowing what to do when you don't know what to do.
Yes.
Is that feeling of like there won't be a right, should, best, right? There'll be a next.
Yeah. Who is anyone else to tell you what you should do for you?
As well.
So when you can remove that limiting belief that there is a way I should be doing things, you can focus on what feels best to do next, and then do that experimentation. It requires a level of almost removing yourself from the situation. Yeah. I am at the moment a vessel that is testing out X, as opposed to my whole being is not correct yet.
Completely that. And it's back to sort of loads of the themes I think we've spoken about today. And I also think that that feeling of lost has got so much like judgment that's keeping you there. Whereas I think that action, that taking a step, just takes us out of that kind of place. I think, again, if you sort of pull that out into positionally lost, right? So you mentioned coming across people that might feel lost in their career. So you can be lost in something because you don't quite know what the next step is. And you look at that at the slightly more positional level, it's like, well, I've been a lawyer for 15 years now. I'm earning the check I thought I wanted to earn. But I'm lost, right? This is like not what I want to be doing. And again, what you're doing is grounding your sense making. What are the things that could happen next for me? And then you're experimenting in the ways that could look different. And I think so much of that is also being kind of reminding ourselves of the inspiration of what we think could be on the other side, right? And allowing that kind of to guide what those next steps are. So it's not completely blind. We always have a glimpse, we have a vision, we have something.
Yes.
Which can help reorient us.
What I always think is so powerful to outline about the vision is that it's the clarity of end details. Maybe talking again about end goals and dream goals. If I can get real clear that in 10 years, I definitely want a business that looks like X, Y, and Z, or that I definitely have achieved A, B, and C, what's important is that as clear as that is, as great as that is, it doesn't have the how. And so the vision isn't about how you get there. That's something different. So regardless of how you get there, you have this end vision or this dream vision. Great. don't be attached. You can be attached to that end goal or really want that end goal,
but don't be attached to the path.
Without being attached to the how.
Exactly.
Because that's when you go, should I be doing this? Should I be? And you just spiral these unhelpful thoughts.
And exactly. And I think it reorients us because it docks us. It's like, this is where we're going. And then actually how we like navigate through it, there could be as many pathways to do that as there are people on the earth, right? But we need to be okay with the fact that we need to keep adjusting that and not being too tied to it. So we talk about that with even our founders being really obsessed with or committed to the problem, but not the solution, right? Because the solution is the how piece, right? The problem is much more around the vision of what you want to see changed. And so I think just, again, that's kind of liberating because it allows you to make all kinds of different sorts of options and choices, and ultimately also stops the paralysis that can come with feeling like you're getting it wrong.
Yes. Once you've done this work on yourself and your inner leader, you may feel like part of your potential is to create something much bigger than yourself, such as founding a business. It takes a lot of courage to do that, though. To summon up the courage, to take the leap, to do this thing that is super risky. It doesn't even have to be, you work with venture-backed businesses, you back them, but it doesn't even have to be that. It can be anything where this is much bigger than me and it's a big risk to throw my lot in with this. That takes a lot of courage to even admit that that's right for you, let alone to actually start doing. How do you build up that courage, work on that courage? What are the conditions for having and building the courage to do something as monumental as a life change that is building the business or something?
It's a great point, and I think a lot about the kind of conditions for courage that we try and create here. And usually people come with a kind of urgency or a kind of frustration or a rocket fuel, which is often quite deep and quite intrinsically motivating, right? So I don't know, I'm really motivated to look at longevity and healthcare differently, and you can give a really rational answer to that, and you can say, actually, like, you can dig a bit and you can be like, well, actually, I'm really motivated by that because my grandparent XYZ, my parent XYZ, I saw when I worked here XYZ, right? And it suddenly starts being a kind of a calling or a vocation. So I think there's definitely something about the boldness beginning with that sense of an individual's own intrinsic motivation and rocket fuel, which I think is the starting point, right? Because ultimately it's going to be scary, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, there's going to be so many people that tell you no. You have to be able to return to that feeling and that belief and that urgency to essentially propel you through those moments, right? So I think there's definitely something about how people show up in the first place. And then I think it's like, what can we do sort of environmentally, contextually to help those conditions of courage? And then I think for me, there's definitely something about who we're exposed to. So quite often we can be in sort of silos of what we've done or what we've, how we've been trained or where we've been working or whatever. And actually something about the collision with difference or the collision with other people really then allows us to kind of go, oh, actually, I can imagine something else. I can imagine something different. So there's definitely something about that. And then I think there's also something about how we, and like maybe as a kind of consequence of that, how we then embolden each other. There's something quite contagious about like seeing other people doing it and being emboldened by that. And I think if we're thinking about the beginning piece as being ourselves, I think the kind of other end of that is possibility and it's inspiration, right? So it's seeing other people that have done it and feeling that sense of kind of identifying with the people that have been there before and done something that other people said they couldn't do, just to, again, propel you through those moments of like when it's really, really hard. So there's where you start from, there's where you see kind of endpoints being or destinations being, inspiration points being. There's something about the people around you relationally kind of giving you permission or inspiring you with difference in order to know that actually things could look in another way and actually create opportunity. There's obviously like the sort of hard skills, and I hate the differentiation between hard and soft, because I think the soft are the hardest. But I think there's obviously some things that can help equip you on that journey. So there's things that can kind of give you that kind of toolkit, if you like. But I think ultimately there is definitely something about the kind of relational nature of this, who you are and where you're going, which basically kind of empowers that feeling.
What if I know I want to do something great, or I want to create something like a business, and I have none of those external factors? I don't have role models in my life I can look to. Maybe I'm seeing, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos online or whatever, but so what if enough of those conditions aren't met, but I still feel like my potential is not being reached and I'm feeling some calling to go do a thing to reach it? What do I do?
I think being really, really clear about the thing is that you want to, so recognizing that, first of all, that sort of frustration. Then thinking, actually, if that is a frustration, that's a unit of energy, right? So that should be like driving the things that you're doing next. So then you're thinking a bit about what it is that's motivating me in this space. Like, why do I need to do it? Let's be a bit more kind of clear, focused, intentional about what that potential looks like. Because there's an evolution there, right? From it just being a sort of feeling that you're sitting on, like I should be doing more, to actually saying, do you know what, it is actually, I do actually want to do something in social isolation and loneliness, right? I really see there's something in this, and kind of getting a bit clear about that. And then I think if we're taking seriously that idea of unit of energy, then you can start putting that to work in the kind of people that you're reaching out to. And I really think that change happens through people, right? It happens through people. So like connections, understanding, like visualizations through people, inspiration through people. So you might not know where to start, but there'll always be somewhere to start. Again, that like next best step. So how do you begin that work of identifying the people that might be doing something in the space that you think is interesting? How do you have the 10 coffees with those people to explore the 10 insights from those individual people into other parts of your world? How do you start creating from that a picture of the vision that you've just been talking about, even if you're really uncertain or unclear of what the pathway is going to look like, right? So I think acknowledging that if we're a work in progress, then that's certainly a work in progress, right? It's definitely an evolution. And moving on from that feeling of frustration into, okay, let's sharpen that. Let's get clear on that, what that might look like. Let's reach out to the first people that I can think about. And there's lots of ways that you can do that more or less effectively, right? And then what kind of environments do I want to be sitting in to try and be exposed to what's happening there? What are the ways in which I can evolve that into a bigger vision?
Yes.
And then how do I start thinking about a plan and a roadmap from that?
Yes, and I think we can even break down even more granularly into what are those next steps. I don't know what to do next. Okay, what would the next step be? You need someone to embolden you with the courage because they're out there doing it. Okay, go find someone doing it. And just have a coffee. And they might say no. Reach out to 10 people really thoughtfully and see what happens. And that can just be the next step. And that can be where you are right now.
Exactly.
And this is the future that you can own. No one else will do that for you, which to me is really empowering.
Yeah.
I've really come to reframe our life is in our hands from an anxiety-inducing thing into a freedom and exciting thing.
Yeah.
When you're gripped in that, I know from experience, when you're gripped in that feeling of, am I good enough for this? That the line between, is this giving me freedom or is this giving me anxiety, becomes real blurry.
Yeah, I completely hear you. And I think, again, I'd like return us to this idea of the power of relationship.
Okay.
Because ultimately, if you're in that space and you know that you've kind of formulating a plan or a change or a pivot or whatever based on this kind of thing, that you actually feel, sometimes we need other people to essentially kind of provide accountability for that process, right? So, and you naturally do it in coaching, but you could be it doesn't have to be a coach, right? It could just be, look, this is what I think I need to do. This feeling is not going away. and I can complain about it 3 times and then I have to do something about it, right? And I've complained about it 5 times now, so I'm going to do something about it. So let's sit down, let's think about what the next best step is, right? It's going to be 10 coffees with people in those spaces. And actually, 7, can you check in on me in a month's time and make sure that I've done that? And get me to talk a bit about like what I've learned.
Yeah, some accountability. Yeah.
Accountability is exactly that. So I think it's like bring people in to that version of you that you're creating or that plan you're trying to manifest. And I think essentially I keep returning to kind of the relationship because I think it's really important. And it also not only in how we're thinking about ourselves, the judgment we place on ourselves, but also our ability to evolve and move forwards.
Yes. There's a Chinese proverb that goes, you can curse the darkness or you can light a candle.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes creating accountability for yourself by going and asking that person, creating the environment that you know you need to go and do the thing you really want to do, and even just asking yourself these hard questions, these are how we light that candle, light the candle within. And I love it. You mentioned at the beginning, confidence. And now we're talking a little bit more about courage. And there's obviously a lot of overlap here, but I have been thinking recently about the difference between courage and confidence and how these two things relate. I mean, what's your perspective?
I think you can be really courageous and still feel really unconfident.
Yes.
And I think it's that thing of what matters most. So, and I think being really in tune with what matters most gives you courage. Doesn't necessarily instill confidence, but you have to kind of assume that is, that will come with the process. And so, for example, if I know that I absolutely need to work in improving the reality of like breast cancer patients, right? I can not feel confident to know that I've got something to say there, but my courage comes from the fact that actually changing the experience of breast cancer patients matters so much to me that emboldens me, right? And then the confidence will kind of catch up. Mm-hmm. So for me, courage is really around that thing of isolating in a really, really clear way what matters to you most and what needs to change, right? And that is a thing that powers the action.
I love this. One is the feeling and one is the action regardless of the feeling. So what one is the noun, one is the verb.
Yeah, and let's just accept that I'm going to feel, underconfident or like an imposter or, out of my depth or ill-equipped or whatever. Let's just accept that's going to be there.
Yes.
But also let's still do it because I know that what matters, that making change in the breast cancer community matters more than those feelings.
I love that. Making it much bigger than yourself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. As we start to wrap up today's conversation, we've gone in a few different directions, but almost all of it has been about starting with who we are in here, starting with the self leader, and working on ways we're getting in our own way or our own challenges. That might mean spending time on anything from skills and competencies to feelings and emotions and perspectives and perceptions and questioning ourselves. And these things take time sitting with yourself. At least just sitting with yourself, if not also working on these certain things. And what I hear a lot from like founders, and I bet you hear this all the time, is where do you get the time? I just don't have the time. What do you say to someone who feels like they don't have the time to work on themselves or work on these things we've talked about today?
We all have the same amount of time. And I think if it matters the most, do it first.
Okay.
So I think there's something in this about the fact that people know it really matters to, for example, understand what they really think about something or what they really feel and believe about something, or what that might look like in relation to the kind of business they're building or the work they're doing, but they're not giving themselves the space and therefore they're like deferring it to saying, oh, maybe in a month's time I'll have an away day and I'll go whatever. I think actually, like, if it matters that much, bring it forwards, make it the first thing that you do in the morning. And for me, that's like a really powerful way of building in that time. And I think, things like morning pages work really well from that perspective.
What's that?
So it's something that really, it's from a book called The Artist's Way. It's, quite an old book now, but I think a powerful one, which is really about us kind of tapping into our own creativity and the things, and really working out, and creativity in the broader sense, right? So what we really kind of are thinking, believing, feeling about things. And the morning pages are just when you wake up, first thing in the morning, you literally just write 3 pages, completely unfiltered, about a question that's on your mind, right? It's something that's just there. You don't overthink it, you don't plan it, you don't ever read it again. You literally just write it. And what's so interesting about that is usually you get a page and a half through your 3 pages and you go, oh yeah, oh yeah. And there's something about doing that first, which kind of clarifies differently the way that we're thinking about the rest of the day. And I think also what people fail on sometimes, and it's true in teams as much as it is in individuals, is realizing that actually by not doing that work, you're losing time. So, for example, let's say you've got a team dynamic where there's this kind of unsaid reality that one person, thinks that the priority should be X, the other person thinks it should be Y, but you kind of never really address it. You kind of keep it, but ultimately every single meeting, like, time is spent with that kind of like tussle, that kind of struggle. Like, pull that forwards and say, let's just have like a conversation immediately about the fact this thing needs to, and us carving out 3 hours to really get into this is going to prevent that from infecting every other conversation that we have for the next 18 months, right? So I think, which is why I started with this idea that we will have the same amount of time, is how we choose to use it, and what we feel like, and back to priorities again, what we feel like are the most impactful kind of problems or areas or things that we need to think about, and then using that, being really sharp and clear on that, and then building in time to really address it properly. And we can do that with ourselves, and we can do that in team.
I love this idea of do what matters most first. This applies on the day-to-day level. So I love that you can start with that. Physically start your day with whatever matters most, straight through to with whatever big transformation you need or want to create, start with what matters most. And that begs the question, how do you know what matters most? We'll usually assume it's something physical. I wonder if there's some noticing of like a pattern here. If there's a pattern of a feeling I have, or a pattern of a challenge I consistently run into, or maybe even create, maybe it's me that is most important, that needs to be worked on
Yes,
first.
no, absolutely. Yeah.
You've mentioned a number of books and authors specifically throughout this conversation. Are there any books you think people need to go out and read? This is just a really practical one I want to ask you specifically, because you've mentioned a lot of authors, which I don't normally get.
Yeah. I have. So I think, just thinking about some of the ones I mentioned today, I mentioned How Women Rise, another book called Playing Big by Tara Moore, a book called Happy High Status by Viv Groskop. I talked a bit about a kind of a goals model, I think, which was by a guy called Whitmore, who's most people in coaching will know, and similarly in coaching, that idea of potential and performance is, Tim Galway, one of the kind of cornerstones of coaching. I also, something I haven't mentioned, but I've really found important, thinking about how we think about development, the alignment of development with organizational goals, and the fact that we want to try and acknowledge the fact that we've all got things to work on and that we're all evolving. The best book on that, I think, is a book called The Never One Culture.
Okay.
And that book is really focused on this idea that organizations need to be deliberately developmental, and they need to be allowing their staff, their employees, to be doing that, to be kind of conscious of that development. And they have models in that book around the kind of environment that you're creating. So they call it home. It's one of trust, psychological safety. The kind of edge. So the idea that we've all got edges that we're crossing, that we're all kind of evolving, and we have backhands or things we need to work on. And then the last one is around like practice. So the ways that it's called groove. So it's the ways that things come to life. So the kind of meetings that you have, the kind of sessions that you hold, the kind of things that you, the ways in which you formalized, ritualized back to kind of tangible versions of culture, structures which help that development process. So that's a book that I kind of recommend quite a lot. And then I think
The Everyone Culture.
An Everyone Culture, I think it's called. Okay. And then the last book I think I just mentioned there was An Artist's Way, The Artist's Way.
Anything by Brené Brown? I love her.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I think I was referring to her in relation to values, right?
Okay.
So I think a lot of what we've been talking about, I think would be kind of echoed in books like Dare to Lead by Brené Brown, you know, that whole thing around daring, courage, leadership,
yes,
vulnerability, and about how vulnerability really shows up in courage, what vulnerability actually means, and being quite precise about that, because it's often, I think, misread. So Dare to Lead would definitely be one I'm pointing.
Love it. Thank you so much, Ellie. This has been really, really practical, and it's gone a number of places. Before we end off, I have a closing question I'd like to ask everyone. As you've probably noticed, I like to get really deep and ask really big questions. And so this is more to do with you than it is to do with anything in business. And I ask every guest this question. The show is called Lost and Searching. And so I'd love to know, what is the biggest question in life that you are still searching for an answer to?
I mean, this is maybe not helpful, but there are kind of big questions that I'm thinking about around things like how much is nature and how much is nurture, right? So how much is kind of who we are, how we're kind of made, and the kind of cultures that we're in and how that influences it and the interplay. That's probably like been the theme. I think practically speaking, there's probably a question that I sit with quite a lot, which is how to scale the kind of thinking or messages or ideas maybe that we've been talking about today beyond like one conversation. And so that feels like something that I'm definitely thinking a lot about. I think what you're getting to in that question as well is maybe something around my own personal mission, because I think it's something which, you know, missions are things that we sort of sit with and search with, look for. And for me, there's just something about like how we, for example, go about creating our work, which reduces what actually influences something being successful, right? So we focus on, for example, I don't know, if you want to start a business, you know, do we have the right skills in the team? Do we have right access to capital? Do we have the right... And we don't focus enough on actually the kind of human qualities which actually guide whether something actually is successful or not. We don't have the lexicon for it. We don't have the language for it. We don't have the job specs that identify those qualities, right? And so I think the kind of question or purpose or mission, I think that's in that is like, how do we get more surface, get more transparent, get more acknowledgement for the kind of human characteristics which actually influence progress or success, and the kinds of things that we really need to be building in young people. And I think AI's got a role to play in that, right? Because I think it's separating out the kind of logos part of who we are into saying actually that can be replicated, but what can't be replicated? You know, our abilities for metacognition, our abilities for adaptability, our influence, our pattern spotting in terms of like human connection, all those kinds of things, I think.
And is that nature-nurture question because you're trying to inform this second big part?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, they're probably connected. They are probably connected. I think it's just been an observation that I've had over my experience that actually there's lots of why things succeed or don't, which are about the humans behind it.
Absolutely.
And that we don't acknowledge that. We often just acknowledge like, oh, the technology was super smart or the market was ready or whatever. And we don't get enough behind actually what did it demand in terms of the tenacity, the resilience, the vulnerability.
I'm really glad you're asking this question because I think more of us need to. I've got a a theory slash thesis, although it's not nearly as like robust as a thesis, but I have a kind of a theory or idea that so much of our success and failure is down to who we are. There are kind of, there are graphs of business success which pretty much they correlate. The more money someone's given, the more likely they are to be successful. It's like things like this, and it makes it sound very transactional, where it is just a market and it is just. But the reason so much of this show is exploring who we are and how we show up, and even what we are, who we are, how we are, what we are, helping us discover and cultivate the greatest inner leaders, because I believe if we start from the right place, the results we create will always be the best that they could be. It's when we get in our own way that we're kind of cut off. And I see people resonating with the concept, but it being very firmly ignored in venture.
Absolutely.
And so I'm really glad I'm not going crazy and the only one asking this kind of
But
question.
I think, better humans build better businesses, right?
Exactly. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Personally.
So, and I think it's like some of the things that at least the counterpoint to that get in the way, around kind of other kinds of behaviors, or even other skill sets not being there, or kind of other environments not created, but that's psychologically safe or whatever it is that's needed. So maybe to kind of answer your question, there's something about how we bring that more front and center, which feels like a quest.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, thank you for asking it, because it's an important one to have asked. Until you ask, no answer can be gained. So it's been great to chat. I really, really appreciate you. This has been a great conversation. It's gone in a lot of really meaningful, significant, energizing directions. So thank you for that. Have this better picture now of how to achieve my own potential, and I hope others do too. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I hope you found it valuable. We've reached a number of really important milestones on this show already. It's only been a couple of months, but I'm so grateful to those of you who not only subscribe, but also who listen this far along, who leave the comments on posts, or who give me really powerful, beautiful messages in response. It's been a humbling journey, and there is so much more to come. If there's something about this episode and the question that we answered, or any of the learnings that you took away that you want to make sure someone else you know understands themselves, then please do share this episode with them, along with your reflections, teaching other people something that you learned, passing the information on, or even just writing it down for yourself. All help you retain the answers to this, and any inspiration it gave you even more. That's the purpose of all this, is to give you as much positive, powerful, impactful results as possible on your journey to developing your own inner leader from so many different dimensions, not just the one we've talked about today. So thank you so much for being here, sending lots of love, and here's to your success.